So, if World War I represented the political collapse of Europe, the Great Depression was the economic collapse. During the 1800s, Europe, the United States, and Japan were rapidly industrializing, and the economy was growing at a rate that had never done before. And the general trend was that the standard of living for most people in industrialized nations was going up. But to lots of people, even during the heyday of industrialization, when it was bringing a lot of benefits, there were some serious problems with it. Some people were critical of industrialization because it created a materialistic society where more traditional values, things like community and spirituality, became less important. And others criticized industrialization because, yeah, it produced a lot of wealth, but this wealth wasn't being shared evenly and social inequalities were not acceptable. So there'd always been criticism of industrialization and the capitalism that went along with it. But things kept churning along until 1929. And in 1929, we have a global economic collapse, and this is often referred to as the Great Depression. People lost their life savings, world trade dropped by 2/3, businesses closed, global unemployment soared, and it was essentially a period of global poverty. And this is really the first time we see a global economic crisis where everyone is affected, and this is because the economy is so connected by this time. And we've seen how the economy has gradually become more and more connected throughout history. So, what caused the Great Depression? That's a hard question to answer. Historians and economists have a hard time pinpointing exactly how the Great Depression started. So it's a complex story, but part of the story, anyway, lies in the aftermath of World War I. After the war, the economy of the United States was booming. The 1920s are called the Roaring Twenties in North America. So it was a time of plenty. And this is because the United States wasn't hurt badly by the war, not like Europe was. The war was actually good for the United States in a lot of ways because the United States was producing food and producing weapons and shipping these overseas to Britain and France, and they were making a lot of money by doing this. By the end of the 1920s, American farms and American factories were producing more things than could be sold. So people couldn't buy everything that was being produced on American farms and in American factories. Europe was still poor because of the war. They definitely couldn't afford to buy all the things that the United States was now trying to sell them. Germany was responsible for paying for the war. So as per the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was responsible for paying all the costs of the war. So they had to make huge payments to Britain and France. To make these payments, Germany had to borrow money from the United States. Germany then paid that money to Britain and France. Britain and France, during the war, borrowed a lot of money from the United States. So now, when Britain and France got the repayments or the reparations from Germany, they had to send the money back to the United States. While all this is happening, Europe is rebuilding its industry and starts producing its own goods, and this lowers demand for American products even more. And what ends up happening, it leads to a crash in stock prices in America and the crash of the stock market, which really brings about a collapse of the trading network between Europe and the United States. Now, we saw how with World War I, Europe's world empires made the war a global event. The exact same thing happens with the Great Depression. These empires made the Great Depression a global event, and the Depression spread to the colonies. The colonies that were the hardest hit were the ones that depended on one or two products, especially if the products were luxury items. So take Brazil, for example. During the Great Depression, Brazil destroyed enough coffee to supply the world for a year. And this was an attempt to keep the world prices artificially high. So we see these seemingly irrational behaviors, destroying food even though people are going hungry, just to keep the price of food high. People didn't have money, so people weren't buying things. People weren't buying cars anymore. This had a major impact on the rubber industry, which was the primary export in Southeast Asia. The Gold Coast, or which is now Ghana, made most of its money through exporting cocoa, which was a luxury item. So all these societies whose economies relied heavily on one or two crops were hurt badly. Gradually, over time, people moved away from subsistence farming. So we saw that happen throughout history, moved away from subsistence farming to work in factories or to work producing cash crops. Subsistence farming doesn't provide the wealth of industrialization and capitalism, but is probably a more stable, more sustainable system. In a broader sense, the Great Depression brought a major challenge to the belief that markets would naturally fix themselves. This didn't happen with the Great Depression and really forced people around the world to take a closer look at what the Soviet Union was doing. The communism of the Soviet Union generated economic growth and zero unemployment during the 1930s. So to some people it looked really good, although they had their own problems, which we'll look at next week. But ultimately none of the Western countries chose to go the communist way, but countries like Britain and France, countries in Scandinavia, made reforms that were influenced by communism. The countries that best coped with the Great Depression were Nazi Germany and Japan. The more democratic countries won World War I, but following World War I, democracy came under attack by new ideologies. And one of the major challenges to democracy was communism, and we'll talk about communism next week. But the much more immediate threat to democracy came from these highly authoritarian, extremely nationalistic, aggressive, and ferociously anti-communist movements in Italy, Germany, and Japan. And these three countries would form an alliance in 1936 to fight off international communism, and then they would go on to form the Axis powers in World War II.